Maria Tremonti has spent her career at the forefront of the constantly changing world of Canadian and international events. You've known her as the compelling host of Canada's most popular radio program, CBC's The Current, for almost 2 decades. I know in our bureau, even before we started working with Anna Maria, we would take our coffee breaks together just so we could listen to her show on a regular basis. Her interviews have also been informed by her many years as a foreign correspondent on international affairs and covering Canadian politics. And then she changed things up. You may also know her now from her very personal and vulnerable podcast, Welcome to Paradise, which showed that even though she's traveled to many conflict zones, none was immediately threatening as what she'd experienced at home. Anna Maria's skill is in seeing the patterns in how our world is evolving, anticipating what will make an impact and resonate with humanity, and thus expressing the chain reactions that will shape our future. Drawing from both her personal experience and the lessons she's learned interviewing others, she sheds light on personal growth and questioning the status quo. Please join me in welcoming Anna Maria Tremonti. Over to you, Anna Maria.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be joining you here. You know, I'm here to tell you a little bit about what I've learned as I've witnessed change, quiet change, big change in different parts of the world. And, you know, there was a moment in my earlier reporting career when I was right in the center of change that shook the world. It was a moment for the history books. And, you know, I thought that would be the biggest thing I ever covered. The date was December 26, wait for it, 1991. And it was the day, it was the actual night, actually, that marked the dissolution or the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole backstory, but a lot of you may remember Soviet Union, superpower, nuclear power, the so-called communist scourge that the politicians in the Western world, especially the United States, were always reminding us about. And the collapse of the USSR, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, all 15 republics, would have a series of domino effects, good and problematic, that would affect the world. And it's still affecting us today, by the way, because Vladimir Putin's relentless quest to make Russia great again is playing out in the war in Ukraine right now, but it has its seeds in how Vladimir Putin saw the collapse of the Soviet Union all those years ago. And that night, back in 1991, I was standing in Red Square. And, you know, I watched as the Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle, came down the flagpole. So there I was on this winter night in my Canadian Arctic parka. I'd bought it in Yellowknife on another assignment, and you know, it was beautiful. It was warm, really pretty, bright red parka. It had hand-stitched details. It had a pretty silvery fox fur trimmed hood. And as I stood there amidst so many wide-eyed Russian citizens with my cameraman, my photographer, I was aware that we were witnessing this moment in history. And the flag was slowly being lowered, never to rise again. And a man comes up to me and he says, "Why are you dressed as Santa Claus?" And in that moment, proof that sometimes monumental change can also contain moments of the absurd, and you can't take yourself too seriously. But the drama that played out that night did and does have domino effects. Some of them are geopolitical, but they also play out individually in people's homes and for individual people, most obviously among regular people caught in the midst of something like conflict. Some of the people who have joined us in Canada now, playing out in their individual lives. And that's emblematic of something I've learned, that some of the greatest dramas also revolve around our own lives. And they almost always involve change that we are not expecting. So why am I telling you this? Because long after that moment in Red Square, when I thought the story would never get bigger than that, I thought, you know, you'll see a lot of stuff, you'll probably never see anything this big. We ended up in the midst of a pandemic. Talk about domino effects. We are now in a moment of time where the world, our own individual worlds and the wider world writ large, seems to be on the cusp of some kind of profound change that we can't even grasp yet. The COVID-19 pandemic has driven us all to an intersection where all the big issues have collided, or they've kind of put us at a crossroads where we're kind of in a gridlock. It's as if we are at the crossroads of medicine and science, politics and geopolitics, economics and business and society, every aspect of society, how we work, how we play, how we learn, how we interact, all of this stuff converging, and we're getting kind of stuck in it right now. Now, there's a lot of good in this, there's a lot of bad, and there's a lot of uncertainty at that intersection, at that crossroads. And, we've seen remarkable things. We've seen leaps in science through COVID. In technology, we all got good at Zoom. We even got COVID puppies. Some of us embraced the gray. We've learned how to slog through things we never imagined we'd have to slog through. But, with that, we also see polarization. We see a lot of anger, and we see fear and uncertainty. And it's happening in real time. This is not a history lesson for us. It's in our face. We are living it. People will look at us and they'll have their history lessons decades down the road. So it's kind of a strange place to be in too, because history is happening to us and people will talk about it after we go through this. And we don't even know where all the dominoes will fall right now. But for all the trouble, the change confronting us can also bring us opportunity and a new way forward. And I really believe the key to moving forward is to start talking to each other and to keep talking to each other and sharing our stories, not just our stories, but sharing our hope, sharing our ideas. We all live in silos. Really, even before COVID, we were all living in silos. And, if you're going through a crisis or if you're struggling to overcome something, you think you're alone in the world. But what if you're not alone in the world? What if you could see others around you and start a random conversation with a stranger, only to discover you're struggling with the same thing or something parallel, that you have challenges that actually speak to what the other one's going through? How would that affect how you see yourself? How would that affect how you see others? How would that affect how you judge yourself and how you judge others? Teresa mentioned, I released a podcast this year, Welcome to Paradise, that's all about what I call the long tail of intimate partner abuse. And it's my story. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail right now, but I will warn you, for some people, it's just hard to listen to this topic at all. So you may find it difficult. But, when I was 23 years old, I married a man who turned out to be abusive. And I got out after a year, and I was very grateful for that. But there were things from that experience that even as I moved forward, even as I found a way to feel that I had agency and that I could really move on with my life, there were things that clung to me. And I didn't know how to shake them. And I was standing in line in the grocery store one day. This was before I left, feeling very sorry for myself. And idly watching the woman in front of me put her stuff on the counter, in front of the cashier. And I'm watching and I'm thinking, oh, look what she's buying. I bet she has a nice life. She can't imagine what I'm going through. And I kept watching. And then I thought, I can't imagine what she's going through. I have no idea. I can't judge her by the groceries on the counter there. She could be like me. She could be going through something like me. And in that moment, as I stood in the grocery store, all the denial that I had started to shift. And I realized I was one of those women that I'd heard about. And, what does it mean to say those women? It sounds so judgmental. And I was judging myself. There was a stigma about abuse, as if we deserved it. And, I thought I did. I thought it was my fault. I was really ashamed. But something in that moment made me realize that maybe there was another way. And, now over the years, I've worked some of those complicated feelings right out of my system. But in the course of working on this podcast, when I thought I had all the answers, I worked with a therapist and we recorded it. We put her sessions, some of them with me, on tape, and we used them. And in the course of doing that, in the talking, because it was talk therapy, I identified more shame. And I came to realize that I still hung on to the shame, and I hung on to some self-blame, And all of that was wound around the pain that I felt back then when I was in my 20s. And I started to think, well, wait a minute, the shame wasn't mine to carry. The blame was not my fault. Like, I knew that intellectually, but I was really starting to talk about it now. And the pain, it was okay that I could look back at that and say, yes, that happened to me, that I can share the pain of that, but it was in my past. And by identifying it and talking through it all with the therapist, Farzana Doctor, who's in the podcast, I managed to let that shame go once and for all. I was not expecting that. I didn't even know I had that level of it, but that's what happened in the conversations that I had for the podcast. Who knew? I mean, I always say conversation's great, but there I was having a conversation. And as I went public with all of this in the podcast, people started writing in. So many people, most of them women, some of them men who had gone through this, watched their mothers go through this. They began writing to me, and the women were sharing their own stories. And that has been, I got to tell you, overwhelming. The majority of them talk about their shame. They identify, they went, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I had that, or I have that. And in so many of those emails, they tell me that hearing me find a way to release my shame was helping them to do the same. It was giving them hope that they could move on too, or it was affirming their own journey in finding a more joyful life away from an abuser. And okay, like, I've got that great job and people didn't think that happened to me, because we have a lot of myths about what happens to people. And we know now that those myths are shattered on so many levels. But it was also the fact that I just talked about it when they needed to hear it. And maybe if someone else had talked about it when they needed to hear it in a conversation, it would have also helped. Sometimes I'm reading these emails and I have to stop. People have reached out with so much trust and kindness. I get pretty emotional about it. And I realize in reading those that we walk by each other every day and we think we are alone as we go through things. But in fact, we all carry parallel threads in our lives. And when you start a conversation or you take part in a conversation, there can be real understanding about that allows us to feel better about ourselves in order to confront the challenges that we're facing. And, the more we understand, the more we help ourselves, the more we help other people. And we'll go back to that judgment thing, because that was all part of it too. I was judging myself, the less we judge. And, I learned another really humbling and valuable lesson about judgment. This time, it wasn't about me judging myself. It was about me judging somebody else. And it's the story of a woman who I had an opportunity to meet, and I didn't want to meet her. Her name is Monique Le Pen. And I don't know if you recognize that name, but she is the mother of Marc Le Pen, the man who killed 14 women at École Polytechnique in 1989. And, she'd written a book. And this was like years later. This was in the, I guess, like maybe a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago. And I said to my producer, I don't want to talk to the mother of a killer. I've got no interest whatsoever. And my producer said, I think you're wrong. I think you should read this book. I think you should talk to her. So I listened. I read the book and I went, you know what? You're right. So she comes into the studio. I'm in Toronto. She's in Montreal. And, this is a terrible story. This is the mother of the man who did this terrible thing. And we start to talk. And she's so nervous. She's actually reading from her book to try to give me answers. And I ask her if she's reading, and she says, yes, my English isn't very good. And I said, your English is just fine. I can understand you perfectly. And this is your story. So please talk to me. So we began to talk. And I asked her how she found out what her son did that night. It was it was early evening, late afternoon, early evening. It was all over the news. And she was a nurse and she was driving home from work and she heard it on the news like everybody else. And they didn't have a name yet for who was doing this. And she goes home. She still doesn't know. She thinks a terrible thing has happened. And she's quite religious and she was going to go to a prayer meeting that night. So she goes to the prayer meeting and she says to the group at the prayer meeting, let's pray for the mother of the killer. She didn't know that was her. She didn't know she was the mother of the killer. And when she found out, she was so upset and she was so ashamed. She talked about how she blamed herself, how she was a feminist and she felt he was against all feminists. And we knew that he was very much, this was an act of violence against women. But she said it was because he was angry at her and she felt she had failed. And she talked about, being in a marriage that was abusive and her son seeing that, and she worried about that. And we talked about what she had learned. And she was so compassionate and she was so sincere. And she had reached out to families who had lost daughters. Not all of them wanted to talk to her, and she understood. But she managed to build some bridges so that they would know that she was so sorry and she was grieving for them for what had happened because of her son. That day in Montreal, the studio technician had seen on the list who was coming into the studio, and he had a cousin who was killed that day by Marc Lepine. And he looked at that and he said to the producer in Montreal, I'm going to set the levels and then I'm out of here. I will not listen to this woman. And I found out later that he never moved from his chair, that he just kept listening because of what she had to say, because of her humanity. And the more we did that interview, and by the time it ended, I was so ashamed of myself for judging her. And it's, so true that we in the media do that to people who are related to people who do bad things. We show up, we put our microphones in the faces of the brothers, the sisters, the mothers, the wives, the husbands. And it's like we do that to people. And I learned there that kind of judgment was just wrong. And that we have to talk to people and find out, because they too are hurting and they too understand what people are going through. None of this brought those women back. Things don't happen in a nice straight line. The families who were devastated by the loss of their daughters didn't necessarily find solace in a story like that. They have their own journeys, and we have to respect that. But Monique Lepine was confronted with the judgment of a wider society, including people like me. And in speaking to her, I understood that we have to find more ways and better ways to help each other, to see those around us for who they are. Not who we think they are, but who they really are. And these connections that we make, these unexpected things that we learn, they allow us to make a better sense of the world where so much is happening around us. And on some levels, it seems really simplistic. If I talk to you and I get a better understanding of who you are, well, the world will be better. But it's that domino effect again, or what they call the butterfly effect. The wings flap there, and this happens eventually over there. One thing here leads to another and another. And, it's not for nothing that military strategists talk about appealing to hearts and minds when they strategize a war. So if they can go after a war with that philosophy, maybe we can go after optimism for that philosophy of just one conversation leads to another and another and another. And, at this moment in time where there is polarization and fear and need, I think we need to consider new ways to think about what we're confronting and the changes we're seeing, new ways that involve compassion. How do we do this and move forward with kindness? How do we invest in a future rather than merely recharge the status quo? How do we find solutions to problems to enhance our society and our own families and the people around us? I think we need to think big, but we also need to think in small ways as well, because small things grow larger, because most big things start small. We know that. Every tree starts with a little seed. Everything small can become big if we take the time and maybe look at things differently. And I think about that in another way. Somebody I met a few years ago, a woman by the name of Gina Cody. Now, Gina Cody is a big, important person. She's an engineer. She's a philanthropist. She's gone to the height of her profession. She's the former CEO of an engineering construction firm called Construction Control International. She's the first woman in the world to have an engineering school named after her. And that school is in Concordia University in Montreal. But Gina Cody didn't start out that way. She grew up in Iran. She ends up coming to Canada to pursue a master's in engineering. She becomes the first woman at Concordia University to get her PhD in engineering. And she starts working, and she's got to work through the ranks. She starts off as a crane inspector. You know, those great big cranes that you see building skyscrapers? She had to walk out to the end of the crane to inspect it. And she remembers the day that as she walked out there, the lone woman on the team, one of the guys made that crane move, which of course is terrifying and not safe and shouldn't have been done. But she keeps working. She keeps inspecting those cranes. And she gets to be a boss. And when she becomes a boss, she makes her business, she makes it her business to try to get rid of the obstacles that make women feel vulnerable like that in the workforce. And at one point she's hiring, and she's seeing the different people come in and they're interviewing, and a woman comes in and she's 7 months pregnant. Now, most bosses don't want to hire a woman who's seven months pregnant. You know, you're going to go on maternity leave and all that stuff. And she said to the woman, "You're 7 months pregnant and you want this job?" And the woman said, "Oh yes, I want this job." And she said, "Well, if you want this job, I'm giving it to you." And she told me that she canceled all the other interviews then and there and gave the woman the job. And she allowed that woman and other new moms to work from home at a time when nobody was doing that. And people were saying, "You can't do that. It's going to hurt productivity." And she said, "You watch." And sure enough, she believed in those employees and they worked beyond the expectations of the others and hers. She made a conscious choice to change the culture. She, with her one thing, kept going in changing other things. She'd go on to become the president of CCI, then the executive chair, the principal shareholder. She'd give so much money away to other things to help other people. She thought differently. She found a way forward when people around her were fighting the change that resulted in her working next to them. And then she created more change that would help others. So let's go back to that tangled crossroads again, that intersection of so many hot button issues that we are all trying to navigate, both collectively and individually. Let's ask ourselves where the change is that is creating something positive. Because if we can identify that change, maybe we can help it grow. We just have to find ways to let in new ideas as well. How do you do that? I had a conversation once with Werner Herzog, the filmmaker, icon. He's like a cult hero now. He's a great big thinker. And I was really intimidated. And we're talking about this film he's working on, and I'm just listening. But the more I listen to this guy, I'm watching him talk and I'm thinking, how does this guy even think? How does his brain work? What? Ask him. So I think I start slow and I say, "Well, what are you working on next?" to kind of see what he says. And he immediately gives me this answer about, "Well, you know, I'm kind of preoccupied because I got these thieves that came into my kitchen." And I'm listening and I'm thinking, wait a minute. I asked him about how he thinks and he's talking about a break and enter, like what's going on here? And I keep listening. And then I realize he's talking about ideas. And I said, "Why do you call your ideas thieves?" And he says, "Well, I don't invite them in. They just come in." And I thought about that a lot because you know what? He says he got his best ideas from ideas that popped into his head uninvited. So think about that. What comes into your mind uninvited? When you get a little bit of time just to clear your head, what pops into your mind? And what in that stuff might be a thread or a little seed that will help you move forward in a new way? You know, they say change is constant. In fact, the only thing about change is that it keeps changing. Like you can't ever stop change. And I really believe that if we keep talking, if we keep trying to have conversations with each other, that change that we fear can be transformed into a change that can spark new ideas. Maybe one little spark, but then it grows and it becomes something else. And it creates a new hope, not just a hope for us, but for our communities. So above everything else, let's just keep talking and listening. That's all I want to say today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria, and really thoughtful journey through the ideas of change and listening and communicating with each other. And I've made that note about the domino effect, and especially when you said, what is the change that's creating something positive? So thank you for that, those skills and that mindset. We are open to a few questions just before we wrap things up. Thank you, Susan. Susan says, I loved it. Thank you. Much appreciated. And there's a question from Sheila about, do you have any tips for opening a conversation?
Yeah, sometimes it's just listening a little bit to what people say to you. It might just be something like you're standing in line and you make a little comment and you listen to how they respond and you can kind of smile about it and then it begins, right? Or, I was, again, my COVID puppy, I'm standing outside the vet one day and I'm waiting because we can't go in, and there's a woman next to me and my dog was, I think, being spayed, right? And she looks at me and she says, is your dog going to be okay? And I thought, well, it never occurred to me that she wouldn't be, right? But I realized from that question, she was waiting for a dog and maybe her dog wasn't going to be okay. So instead of it, I said, oh, she'll be fine. And then I looked at her and I said, but what about your dog? And she said to me, she started to talk about her little dog who was dying and she was waiting for the vet to give her some medicine to take the dog home because she says, I want my dog home with me. And then she looked at me and she said, I lost my husband to COVID 6 months ago. And we had this very short, emotional, heartfelt conversation on the street. And, I could have just said, yeah, my dog will be fine, vets today, they're getting a lot of business. But instead, I just said, how's your dog? Because the way she asked it, I heard something. So trust your gut. When you hear something, pick up on it. It doesn't even have to be intrusive. It's just like, oh, what do you think? And people will talk to you.
Thank you for that. And I'm seeing more comments coming in. We'll certainly be sharing those with Anna Maria. And another question as it relates to the business world. So many people are working remote these days, and we're hearing that going back to the office isn't so much about going back and working, but actually connecting with each other and having conversations with each other. Can you speak a little bit to the power of those essential skills with each other?
Yeah, I think there's something like, I really appreciate how working from home really works for a lot of people. But I think we have to ask ourselves if there's a way we can get together once in a while if it works for a company, because I think about those accidental conversations in an elevator. I think about, for me at the CBC, my best networking place was the women's washroom by the current, sorry for the guys, but I mean, but those moments, or you walk by a desk, and you go, oh, can I ask you a question? Like, you just have these things that are that little bit of cohesiveness that allows you to have a question, and, you talk to someone, or you pass the same person in the hall every day. And the other thing I think is helpful is for people starting in a business to have access to some of, to the brain trust in any organization, right? Because there's mentoring, but there's also that sort of mentoring by osmosis, where they're just in the room and they hear how you think, and they hear how you react to things in a way that you can pick up on, that goes beyond a Zoom conversation. I'm a big believer in the messages and silences, and how people pause as they talk and stuff. And some of that, it really works well face-to-face. And I think that matters. I think we still need face-to-face interaction. And I do think that's really important. And some of us actually want to remove ourselves from our messy offices. You can't tell what's in this office, let me tell you. So if you can find a happy medium, if you can have a discussion about it, I think there are real benefits that even people who can't come in all the time would agree would help them.
Thank you. Totally agree. And we need to find more opportunities to get together while we're doing the work in other places potentially as well. I'm seeing still some of the comments coming in. Thank you, Beverly, who appreciated, Anna Maria, your prompt to be mindful of what comes into our heads uninvited. And I would agree. And I received a comment partway through. What an incredible woman Anna Maria is. Her words never fail to take my breath away and bring tears to my eyes. So you've certainly taken us on a journey today. Thank you so much for your insights and giving us just a few more of the skills and techniques that we can take into our day-to-day. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And thanks for those lovely messages. And thanks you guys for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anna Maria, and thanks, agreed, to our audience that's participated today. We welcome any of your additional comments and look forward to helping you with your programming. Hopefully, Anna Maria is a great match for some of your coming events in 2023. We are always here to help. Thanks and take care.